So everyone, welcome back to this new video. And in this video, this is going to be part 2 in a series of 4 videos covering everything you need to know for Edexcel's A-Level History and specifically Route D. And in this video, we're going to be discussing the failure of revolution in the years 1848 to 51. So here's a quick look then at the specification, going over everything what we're going to be covering in this video. So feel free to pause the video here if you'd like to take note of that. But let's have a quick introduction then. The revolutions of 1848 caused a major shift in German politics, but for a brief time, it then appeared that the status quo was restored. To a large extent, the events of the revolutionary period were predicated on the relative strengths of the two German powers, those being Austria and Prussia. Both states experienced serious revolutions in March 1848, where the governments were forced to flee and the monarchs forced to introduce programs of liberal reforms. The situation was perhaps worse for Austrians, as Hungary, geographically the largest area of the Habsburg Empire, was in open revolt against the Habsburg monarchs until August 1849. This weakness allowed German liberals to seize the initiative and to call a national parliament at Frankfurt with a view of national unification. There were counter-revolutions later in 1848 and the parliament lost influence and the great powers reasserted their influence. Austria would continue to take the lead in German affairs as it had since 1815, with Russia playing a secondary role. So, to what extent did the Frankfurt Parliament obtain its objectives by 1849? And the War Parliament. In early March 1848, the Federal Diet sensed liberal influences grow, so they began to make concessions, and they set up a committee to produce a revised constitution. However, lacking faith in the unelected Diet's ability to bring about genuine change, leading liberals from southwest Germany held their own meeting in Heidelberg on the 5th of March 1848. It was decided to call a national parliament in Frankfurt to consist of members from all over the Confederation. A committee of 7 was appointed to make the necessary arrangements. The committee invited notable liberals and representatives from the state assemblies from all over the Confederation to attend a session they called the War Parliament or Pre-Parliament. It was openly acknowledged that the key issue was how to unify Germany, but to become the legitimate body in which Frankfurt would have to go through, the body in Frankfurt would have to go through some of the election process in order to call itself an actual parliament. The task facing the War Parliament was not without difficulty. The terms by which it would be elected, the frequency and conventions of the meetings, the scope of the main body, the organisation of subcommittees and the administration of the whole organisation were all matters that had to be addressed, and from a starting point of nothing. Many in the War Parliament had hoped for an assembly elected by a broad franchise, however this was not to be. The majority of members could be described as middle class. For example, out of the 585 members, 157 were lawyers, 138 were civil servants and over 100 were academics. There were only 4 artisans and 1 singular peasant. Another issue being that the number of members was not equally balanced across the Confederation. So the nature and work of this Frankfurt Assembly or War Parliament, which became known as the Frankfurt Assembly. The first task facing the new parliament was the establishment of a central provisional government for the whole of Germany. It was decided to elect an imperial administrator to build a government. This role was offered to Austrian Archduke John, who was the brother of Emperor Ferdinand and well known for his liberal views. He accepted the roles and invited nobles from across the Confederation to serve within his government. Once a provisional government was in place, he could begin to look at the central task of writing a new constitution for the greater German state. One of the most important questions was who should belong to this new Germany. The main problem was that the two major powers, Austria and Prussia, governed areas that the majority of the population were not actually German. Prussia ruled over Posen, where the large majority of people were Polish, but this was nothing to the diversity of the crown lands of the Austrian Empire. The revolutions of 1848 had worsened relations between the minorities and their German-speaking governments. The Hungarians were in open revolt against the Habsburg Emperor, and the Czechs formed the Prague National Committee to push for greater autonomy of Bohemia. Czech nationalists also called for a boycott of the elections to the Frankfurt Parliament, and when asked to be a delegate, Franciszek Pallis refused on the grounds he was Czech and not German. The possible solutions to this issue filtered down to 2 broad schemes. These became known as Großdeutschland or Greater Germany and Kleine Deutschland or Little Germany solutions. The Große Deutschland solution was to include all of Prussia and Austria into a Greater Germany, regardless of the language of the peoples who lived there, and Kleine Deutschland solution would include non-German speaking areas of Prussia and all of the Austrian Empire. Would exclude. I do apologise. So the Kleine Deutschland would exclude non-German speaking areas of Prussia and the entirety of Austria, whereas Große Deutschland will include all of those areas. In the summer of 1848, the Frankfurt Parliament was at its most popular. The Assembly had been meeting for several months and appeared to be making progress towards some of its goals. The appearance, however, of what was happening did not show the serious weaknesses in the new Parliament's position. Some of these disagreements then. A great challenge facing the Frankfurt Parliament came from the major powers within the Confederation, namely that of Austria and Prussia. They both, along with Hanover, refused to allow their soldiers to swear an oath of allegiance to the imperial administrator, safe in the knowledge that there was nothing the Parliament could do to enforce this. In July 1848, Prussia also indicated that it was pursuing its own foreign policy rather than falling in line with the policy emanating from the Frankfurt Parliament. Following an uprising in Copenhagen, the Danish government collapsed, and this worried the Germans in Schleswig-Holstein, it's hard to pronounce, who took measures to defend themselves. The Prussians intervened and drove the Danes back into Denmark, but when asked by the Frankfurt Parliament to pursue this conflict with more vigour, the Prussians, sensitive to intervention by foreign powers, signed a peace treaty with the Danes in August 1848. Having been bypassed by the Prussians, the imperial government in Frankfurt resigned in protest. This illustrates a fundamental weakness of the Frankfurt Parliament. It had a foreign minister with very few ambassadors, a war ministry with no army, and a minister of finance with no taxable income. While it was debating issues such as people's rights or the unification of Greater Germany, when it actually came to running the country, there were still independent state governments who were not willing to cede power to it. So the 50 Articles. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1848, committees of delegates had been working on a new legislation. These laws were to enshrine the basic rights of all German people into federal law. The idea that people had rights at all was a rather revolutionary idea in and of itself at the time. Much of what found its way into the 50 Articles was a reflection of the grievances put forward by liberals and nationalists in the years leading up to 1848. The publishing of the 50 Articles in December 1848 was a major achievement by the Frankfurt Parliament and gave many of the members the kind of liberal reforms they craved. Working on the constitution was progressing steadily, but the shape of the new unified Germany had still not yet been decided. So then let's look at the collapse of the Assembly, or the Frankfurt Parliament. Austria had, since early in the summer of 1848, played a more active role in the Parliament. The appointment of Austrian statesman Anton von Schmeling as Prime Minister in late September 1848 led to a new uprising of radical leftists in Vienna, which caused the Austrian government to flee the city. The Austrian army soon put down this uprising, but an event during the military action led to the Frankfurt Parliament being undermined further. Robert Blum, a radical member of the Frankfurt Parliament, took part in this Vienna uprising, and the army captured and executed him. He should, however, have been protected by parliamentary immunity. The fact that the Austrian government ignored this and executed Blum indicated that they did not take the Frankfurt Parliament seriously at all. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the debate in the Parliament was still between the Kleine Deutschland and Große Deutschland solutions. The question had boiled down to should the new Germany contain Austria or not. It was a mixture of Austria boldness and Frankfurt's pragmatism that arrived at a resolution. The new Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph, reorganized the Austrian Empire and concentrated more power within Vienna. On the back of this, Prince Schwarzenberg suggested it to the Frankfurt Parliament that the new Germany be ruled from Vienna and would incorporate all the lands of Austria and Prussia. This was simply unacceptable to the Parliament. When the Constitution was finally published in March 1848, the new Germany had the same borders as the old Confederation. And that really means it only included a part of northwestern Austria and not the whole of Austria. But it also wasn't the Kleine Deutschland solution, which excluded all of Austria. So really the borders which they proposed in 1849 were the same borders what they were maybe 9-10 years ago. The significance of the weaknesses and political divisions. Ultimately, the squabbling between groups within the Frankfurt Parliament became more significant than the work of the Parliament and the ideas of liberalism and nationalism. As Prussia and Austria began to distance themselves from the Parliament, its effectiveness began to decrease. However, having a defined state, a constitution and a parliament, all Germany now needed was a monarch. Early in 1849, a delegation offered the crown of Germany to Frederick William IV of Prussia. Realising that acceptance would most likely cause a war with Austria, he refused. Moreover, as a monarch who believed he had been given the throne of Prussia by God, he was wary of accepting a throne from an elected body. And on top of this, Austria, following the vote to exclude it, had already withdrawn its members and rejected the constitution entirely. It would not accept a unified Germany without being a part of it. Other states, notably Hanover, Saxony and Bavaria, soon followed suit. The Prussians ordered their members to leave on the 14th of May 1849, a move which signalled effectively the end of the Frankfurt Parliament. What was changed by the Prussian Revolution of 1848 and 49? The Prussian Revolution followed closely events in France and southwest Germany. It followed a similar pattern insofar as street violence precipitated concessions and the promise of liberal reform. The government of Frederick William IV, however, though weakened, did not fall. It rode out the troubled times and was able to re-establish authority by the end of 1849. Events in Berlin and the response of Frederick William IV. In an area of Berlin known as the Tiergarten, a wooded park close to the centre of Berlin, which was reserved as an amusement area for ordinary people, small political meetings began to take place. By the 13th of March 1848, the crowd gathering around the tents in the Tiergarten numbered an estimated 20,000, and they began to petition for political, legal and constitutional reforms. Alarmed by the size of the group that had established by the tents, the Prussian authorities brought soldiers into the capital. What followed was a series of incidents in which both sides tested the other. Men in uniform were attacked in the streets and were told only to go out in large groups, and firearms were being accidentally discharged, which gave rise to the rumour that soldiers were firing upon protesters. This all came to a head on the 18th of March. The king gave command to the troops to the aggressive general Maximilian von Prittwitz, and ordered him to clear the royal square, but that bloodshed should be avoided. The crowd refused to yield, and the soldiers resorted to using their sabres and bayonets. Soon, barricades were thrown up all over the city, and fighting went on between demonstrators and soldiers well into the night. And seeing this, the king ordered the withdrawal of all troops from the city to the army camp in Potsdam. He then issued a statement calling for calm and guaranteeing the safety of the civilian population. The king had a sense of what was coming and was trying to avoid revolution. Censorship of the press was abolished, and Frederick William made it clear that he identified with the movement for German unification. Removing the soldiers from Berlin had put an end to the violence, but left Frederick William terribly exposed. The army was fuming with his order of withdrawal. On the 25th of March 1848, the king travelled out to Potsdam to speak to his officers. He told them that it was safe in Berlin and that the troops would not be returning to the capital. He asked for their renewed loyalty during this difficult time, and the officers did not like what they were hearing, but were honour bound to obey their commander-in-chief. This Potsdam speech was a brilliant move by Frederick William. Not only had he preempted any attempt by the generals to act unilaterally, but he also made them reaffirm their loyalty to the monarch. Frederick William could now begin the process of assembling a new liberal government. So let's have a look then quickly at this liberal government. Traditionally, Prussia had been governed by the nobility, many of whom were generals in the army or land-owning Junkers from eastern Prussia. The government appointed at the end of March 1848, after this uprising, represented a departure from this. Both the Prime Minister, Gottfried Ludolf Camphausen, and the Minister of Finance, David Hasselmann, were liberal businessmen who came from the Rhineland. Their first act was to pass a law enabling election to a Prussian National Assembly. Every adult male who lived in Prussia was eligible to vote as long as they were not recipients of poor relief. Although still dominated by the upper and middle classes, the Prussian United Estates had a far greater proportion of artisan and peasant delegates than the counterpart assemblies in both Frankfurt and Vienna. So conservative reaction and then counter-revolution. Part of the issues facing the Prussian National Assembly from the moment of its inception was the attitude of the king. Although outwardly engaged in the process of unification and liberal reform, Frederick William was at heart deeply conservative. By September 1848, the violence of March had long passed, and the king felt confident enough to appoint ministers who were in the mould of the old guard. General Ernst von Fummel became Prime Minister, and it was hoped that he would appeal to both sides. He was, sure enough, a general in the army, but he was also an intellectual and a patriot, and was very popular with the liberals for being tolerant and calm. Even he, however, was unable to bridge the gap between the king and the assembly, and he resigned on the 1st of November 1848. There could have been no clearer sign that the revolution was over than the appointment of Count Friedrich Wilhelm von Brandenburg as Prime Minister to succeed General Fummel. The assembly immediately sent a delegation to the king to protest the new appointment. They, however, were summarily dismissed. The next week, Brandenburg presented himself to the Assembly and announced it would be adjourned until the 27th of November and would reconvene in the city of Brandenburg. The Assembly saw this adjournment as an infringement of its rights. It called for passive resistance and a tax boycott. Within hours, General Ragnall entered Berlin with 13,000 regular troops and took control of the city, and the delegates were dispersed. 2 days later, on the 11th of November, martial law was declared and the city militia was disbanded. Political clubs were closed and radical newspapers were banned. The king had not only retaken the capital but also reclaimed the power to run the state as he saw fit. Some members of the Assembly tried to reconvene in Brandenburg on the 27th of November but were prevented from doing so by the army, and the Assembly was formally dismissed on the 5th of November. On the same day, the government announced that there will now be a new constitution. So, the Prussian Constitution. Like the Frankfurt Parliament, the first task facing the Prussian National Assembly was to write a constitution. A draft document was prepared quickly. However, Frederick William was not happy with the document and insisted that the phrase "by the grace of God" be inserted to indicate his divine right to rule. The problem was that the conservative right felt that the new constitution went too far left, but the radical left felt it did not go far enough. Having promised his people a new constitution in 1848, it behoved Frederick William to make good on this promise. However, the constitution on 1850 was a masterpiece of conservative reactionism, as it consolidated the power of the monarch and guaranteed independence of the army. The new constitution provides an assembly of 2 chambers, the Abgeordnetenhaus, the lower chamber, and the Herrenhaus, or upper chamber. The lower chamber was elected by a system of 3-class suffrage. Thus, a third of the deputies were elected by the highest rate of taxpayers, another third by the middle tier, and a final third by the lowest tier. And the upper chamber was modelled on the British House of Lords, and thus all its ministers and members were nobles who were selected by the king. The constitution itself contained much that was procedural. There was, however, conservative clauses which could be used against potential opponents. Authorities were once more permitted to censor newspapers and to ban them outright when they saw fit. It also stated categorically that the army was not bound by this constitution. In what ways can the revolutions of 1848 be seen as a failure? As we have seen, historians have differing opinions as to whether or not the revolutions of 1848 were a failure. In terms of attaining their lofty goals of unification and a constitutional liberal state, the liberals in 1848 had failed in the short term. The reasons for this lie in the nature of the German Confederation. The dynamic of the revolution was a very narrow strand of genuine support from the Frankfurt Parliament. The German Confederation was dominated by the forces of the conservative reaction. This was principally the army and the church. It is highly significant that at no point did these institutions throw their lot in with the liberal reformers. Avoiding all-out civil war was one of the most important factors that allowed the ruling elites to ride out the revolution and reinstate their authority. The church also had no wish to see radical change. This was particularly true for the Roman Catholics of the South, who instinctively regarded Catholic Austria as far more benevolent than Protestant Prussia. Counter-revolution and the strength of conservative force across Germany. The revolution of 1848 was largely a middle-class affair. Despite the talk of popular reform and people's rights, the new liberal assemblies in Frankfurt, Berlin, and throughout the Confederation were dominated by the middle classes. However, as the revolution progressed, the radical left became increasingly less satisfied with the reforms being made and demonstrated accordingly. The fear of violence and the overturning of the social order pushed the liberal reforms towards the forces of the conservative reactionaries. The 2 most powerful groups aiming for change were thus divided. Another strength of the conservative forces was the artisan guilds. They wanted to protect themselves against cheap mass-produced goods, so they sought to impose tariffs on foreign goods, which goes directly against the revolutionary liberal idea of free trade. Ultimately, the powers of conservative reaction bided their time and struck when the revolution had run out of steam. The Frankfurt Parliament, for all its high ideals, had achieved little in the way of practical progress, and in the course of their deliberations the factions moved further apart. As events moved on, it became clear to the various parties that unification at this time was not in their interest, and unification and liberal reform by a way of a broad consensus sometime in the future was a realisable possibility. So, the revival of Habsburg power in Austria. Much like Prussia, the Austrian authorities went along with the liberal mood at the time. They really had little choice else. The Austrian authorities made tentative steps to regain their power during the summer of 1848. Confident that the regular troops were still loyal to the crown and more than a match for the revolutionary mob, General Wychengrac was dispatched to Prague to put down any possibility of a Czech revolt. By the end of the summer, only Vienna and the separatist Hungarians remained defiant. In October 1848, the Austrian army, led by Wychengrac at the head of 60,000 troops, moved against Vienna. He was opposed by the radical city militia, who numbered 100,000, but they were no match for the well-equipped and drilled regular troops. Though the street skirmishes led to 2,000 casualties, many of the citizens welcomed the troops as liberators. Alarmed by the possibility of revolution spreading across Russian Poland, the Tsar had offered troops to help the Austrian cause. Facing a war on two fronts and against armies twice their size, the Hungarian rebels finally surrendered in August 1849. Weaknesses of and divisions among revolutionaries. Despite the triumph of the conservative right in the Austrian Empire and Prussia and the collapse of the Frankfurt Parliament, there was still revolutionary activity in 1849. It amounted to very little in terms of precipitating political change, but the large numbers involved in certain cases are illustrative of the depth of revolutionary feelings that still remained. The revolutionaries were divided in two ways, socially and geographically. The liberals of Prussia had a different agenda from the liberals of Austria. This is most apparent in the Große Deutschland and Kleine Deutschland question. Class also played a significant role, as lower class revolutionaries began to feel that they were not being represented by the liberals of the middle classes. Also, what undermined the revolutionary cause was that the regular troops remained loyal to their rulers. Prussian soldiers in Berlin and Austrian soldiers in Prague and Vienna retained their discipline and were used to restore power of the conservative regimes. Further revolutionary action took place in the Palatinate and Baden in May 1849. Some 30,000 workers and artisans flocked to the revolution militia, and Grand Duke Leopold had to flee the country as army bases began to mutiny. The ousted authorities called on the Prussians for assistance, and in July 1849, two Prussian army corps led by Prince William invaded the Palatinate and put the revolutionaries to flight. On the 23rd of July, they surrendered and the captured leaders were court-martialed and summarily executed. How did the revolutions of 1848 change German politics? The ambitions of Prussia and Austria between 1849 and 51. Despite the rejection of the German crown by Frederick William in April 1849, the Kleine Deutschland solution to the unification question still appealed to the Prussian elite. The idea of a German state was thus put forward to Austria, who refused to accept the plan. From Joseph von Radowitz, a close advisor to the king, this was not the end of the matter. He organised a League of Three Kings with Saxony and Hanover. There was an element of intimidation involved, as Prussian troops were putting down revolutionary rebellions across Germany, so many agreed to join. However, Hanover, fearful of Prussian dominance, agreed to join only if Austria and 17 other states were persuaded to join. In June 1849, it was agreed that the League would adopt the constitution agreed by the Frankfurt Parliament. The election of this new assembly would be via the Prussian three-class system, meaning domination of the wealthier classes. By the time this new union met in Erfurt in March 1850, there was very little of the union left. Bavaria and Württemberg decided not to join as they were nervous of Prussian dominance. Saxony and Hanover, original members of the League, both seceded for the same reasons. In the end, under pressure from the conservative voices within Berlin, Frederick William announced he would restrict the union and not swear an oath of allegiance to it. So, the re-establishment of the German Confederation. To counter the threat of the Kleine Deutschland solution embodied in the Erfurt Union, Schwarzenberg revived the Federal Diet in Frankfurt in May 1850. Austria naturally assumed the presidency and invited states and representatives. 10 states who were not members of the Erfurt Union sent representatives. There were now two bodies, each with deputies sent by member states, claiming some right of governance in Germany. One was led by Prussia and the other was led by Austria. Civil war in Germany was now a frightening possibility. There were two potential flashpoints for a civil war. Fighting broke out between Denmark and Prussia over Schleswig-Holstein. Austria, acting on behalf of the Federal Diet, offered to support the Danes against the Prussians. However, under the threat from Russia, Prussia signed a peace treaty with Denmark in July 1850 before matters could escalate further. The accumulating tensions, however, finally came to a head in September 1850 in Hessen-Kassel. This was a small electorate that lay between eastern and western Prussia. The Prussians mobilised troops and things looked like they would lead to war following a dispute. On the 24th of November, backed by Russia, Austria demanded Prussian troops to withdraw from Hessen-Kassel within 48 hours. Prussia agreed to negotiate and a conference was arranged. In Prussia, this conference and subsequent treaty became known as the humiliation of Olomouc. I can't pronounce that, I'm sorry. The Prussians agreed to demobilise their army and to contribute to a federal action in Hessen-Kassel. Prussia and Austria agreed to work together to negotiate a reformed German confederation. Buoyed by this success, the Austrians pushed for a confederation that included all Austrian crown lands. However, they misread the situation and unfortunately overplayed their hand. Prussia quite naturally opposed this scheme, but so did Russia, France and Britain, who did not want to see Austria dominate Central Europe, as this would not be conducive to stability in Europe. The only alternative in Europe was the restoration of the Confederation as it had been before March 1850. The only German assembly was the Federal Diet, still dominated by Austria and with the same powers as before the Revolution. The fundamental rights of the German people, or the 50 Articles, was declared null and void. Constitutions so readily granted by German princes in 1848 and 49 were suspended, and reactionary rule was thus reimposed. So the significance of revolutionary failure and for German nationalism and liberalism. In the 3 years that followed March 1848, liberals and nationalists had made significant gains throughout the Confederation and lost them all. What had changed were ideas. The actuality of a German parliament governing Germany through a German constitution was not going to be forgotten. The reactionary rule of the 1850s and 60s was thus therefore a different one. It was not the ancien regime of the 18th century, nor the Restoration Germany dominated by Metternich. It had a character of its own, where conservative ministers, always sensitive to the possibility of popular demonstration, were measured in their approach to government. Social policies designed to win the support of the masses were implemented all over Germany. Prussian peasants were freed from their feudal obligations and granted loans from state banks in order to set themselves up as tenant farmers. Perhaps the most significant impact of the Prussian revolutions was the change in the relationship between Austria and Prussia. Before 1848, Prussia had been ratified to follow the Austrian lead. However, the Kleine Deutschland, Große Deutschland argument had shown Prussia that it could be the leading state in a unified Germany. That, at a time of Austrian weakness, demonstrated to the Prussian leaders that they could take the lead in a united Germany. The rivalry between Austria and Germany for German hegemony began with the events of 1848 and 49. So, just a quick summary then of everything we've covered. Events between 1848 and 51 sent seismic waves throughout the German polity. The major powers of Austria and Prussia were so weakened that an assembly, the Frankfurt Parliament, could lay claim through popular support to be the rightful government of a united Germany. The fact that Austria and Prussia had to deal with the Frankfurt Parliament and indeed had to introduce liberal reforms in their own state is a testimony to their weakness and the strength of the feelings of the liberals and the nationalists. Ultimately, however, the ruling elites regained their strength and the liberal gains were reversed. It is perhaps a reasonable argument to state that the 1848 revolutions changed much in the short term and much in the long term, but very little in the medium term. So let's just again have a quick look at the specifications and make sure we've covered everything. So we've discussed the Frankfurt Parliament, or the War Parliament, and the nature and work of the Frankfurt Assembly, including disagreements on the 50 Articles, the collapse of the Assembly, significance of weaknesses and political divisions. We've also then looked at revolutions in Prussia, events in Berlin and the response of Frederick William, and the liberal government which was introduced, and the conservative counter-revolution, and the newly introduced after that Prussian constitution. We also then looked at the failures of the revolutions, obviously again the counter-revolutions and the revival of Habsburg power in Austria, and the weaknesses and divisions amongst the revolutionaries. And finally then we've looked at the political impacts of the German revolutions, the ambitions of Prussia and Austria, and the re-establishment of the Confederation, and the significance of failure for nationalism and liberalism within Germany. So thank you very much for watching, As mentioned at the start of this video, this is part 2 in a series of 4 for everything covered for Edexcel's A-Level History Route D, Paper 2. So please check out the first video and the other videos are coming in this series after this. I've also done everything you need to know for Route 1 already uploaded on, but for Route D, Paper 1, I'm sorry, already uploaded on my channel. So please check that out if you would like help with that. Also in the future, I'll be releasing videos of everything you need to know for Route D for Paper 3. So thank you very much for watching.